Billy, you ready to go, buddy?
I think so.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to introduce my friend, Billy Hollis. Billy has a formal bio, so I'll read it a little because it says some cool things about him. He's a designer and developer, which is an interesting combination. You'll notice by Billy's lovely white hair that he's been around a while, which means he lacks, no, he does not lack opinion. And he has lots of wisdom, though, to share with you. He has consulting practice in Nashville, Tennessee. I think people know that's in the US because we were here. And the bottom line is Billy has a little wit and wisdom to share with you about the value of user experience design, and you might even talk about why even HoloLens might be cool. Maybe?
Maybe. If I can get my touchpad to work, I just spilled some water on it.
So I'll keep talking.
There we go. I think I've wiped it off.
You done?
Yeah.
You ready?
Let me get my slides up, and then I'll take over.
All right. Come on. You can do it.
I can do it. Let's see. There's my slides.
Billy.
No? Yeah.
Come on, Billy. Come on. Help me out. I'm stupid up here. Thank you. You ready?
Now let's get this
little
video
button.
over. There we go.
Ladies
I believe
and
I'm ready.
Mr. Billy Hollis.
Thank you. Yeah, I tend to look at things a little differently than most people. Because I have been around a long time, I've listened to a lot of very smart people, and I've tried to understand what they say, and sometimes what they say is kind of contradictory. For example, how many of you do most of your development in C#, if that's your primary language? See, that's almost the entire room. Here's Anders Heilsberg. He's the architect of C#, so I guess most of you folks would know him, right? He created Delphi. He created Turbo Pascal. And he said this in a session at Microsoft that I attended in 2010. We have taken the imperative model of programming about as far as we can. Now, that's a pretty bold statement from somebody who probably knows more about modern languages than anybody else on the planet. And he explained why that was true, etc. And yet, we're still kind of using his stuff, and the biggest change over the last few years is that we use JavaScript a lot. And everybody tells us that we should, or a lot of people do. Apparently we're just pebbles, right? The avalanche has come, and that's what I'm told anyway. Well, yeah, but this guy, who's a high executive at Microsoft, at Build 2015 says, JavaScript at a point becomes kind of unmaintainable. The fault basically lies in the language itself. So don't let anybody tell you that they've got the right answer for where we're going, or just keep doing what we're doing and maybe doing it a little bit faster. No, we're in an era of such incredibly rapid change that really isn't, of all of the ways to look at it, of all the predictions to make, saying that we're going to keep doing things the way we always have is the one that's most likely to be wrong. Okay, as Brian mentioned, this afternoon, we're going to give some of you a chance to wear this. We have 4 of them. I own 2. I don't program it in JavaScript, by the way. This represents the kind of thing, the ways of change that are coming in our industry. I mean, we're turning the world upside down with the kind of technology that we're putting in place. So is the current thinking on application development really ready for the kind of challenges that we face when we're going to be working with things like this? Well, I'm not sure that just doing things the way we always have, but better and faster, is the answer to the kind of changes that we have. In fact, I think that one of the big ways of thinking about things is going to change from that imperative programming model that Anders Heilsberg says we've about tapped out into some different ways of thinking about how we assemble solutions. In fact, I have not really used that imperative model exclusively since the mid-1990s when I learned object orientation and began to think about problems in what the theorists call a compositional way. So that's the theme of what I want to talk to you about today. A different way of thinking about how you apply the technologies you have to solve the problems that you have instead of the code-centric ways that most of you have been used to, and that, to be honest, a lot of the folks at this conference will still show you ways to do. Now, there's value in those sessions. If you go back to your businesses and you're a few percent more productive for being here, your employer, whoever paid your price, is going to benefit from that. And I don't mean to say that those sessions don't have value, but if you've got that sort of cold chill that maybe things are changing out from under you too fast, you know that, you ever had that dream where you're stepping on the brake and the brakes don't respond and you're sliding? If you have that feeling about technology today because it's changing so fast, then you ought to look at some different ways of solving problems, and I'd like to present one to you. Now, I'm not very dogmatic. I'm not dogmatic about process. I'm not dogmatic about what technology you use. I have the ones I like. But I am presenting this to you as an option that you may like, you may choose to use. I find it very useful. I've been using it for over 20 years, thinking about problems from a much more compositional standpoint, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about my approach and how I see it applying throughout the industry. What is composition anyway? Well, the dictionary definition says composition is combining parts, pieces, elements to get a bigger whole. How does that apply to the world at large? Well, you can use it in various ways. This book right here says this is how you compose stuff you find around your office into weapons. You never thought about that, did you? Take the pieces that you've got in your office and combine them in some new ways, and you have weapons. You are composing weapons out of office supplies. So the theory of composition is really all over the place. What composition does is give you a new way of thinking about a problem. See, if you never thought about composing pieces into weapons, then now you're going to go back next week and start making catapults out of rubber bands and spoons if you buy that book. It gives you access to a huge number of combinations. And this space of combinations that you have then allows you to sort of search the space for the precise combination that solves the problem that you have, so that you stop thinking about problems so linearly and procedurally. Unless the problem happens to be a very linear problem, you stop thinking about it that way, and you start thinking about an approach that puts together the right pieces to solve it. Composition shows up in a lot of places. I think about it a lot because XAML is a very compositional platform, and I'm going to be doing several examples in that. But the value of composition is all over the place, and I've been using compositional concepts since the mid-1990s, as I mentioned. It shows up in HTML5 and JavaScript. Why do you think we have all this momentum towards frameworks to do things? It's because HTML5 fundamentally needs to be compositional to bring all the pieces together to make up the pages and applications that we need. And yet it really doesn't have the compositional capabilities at its core that it needs. So we add more things to it to get better compositional capabilities. Angular is basically a way to hook pieces together, isn't it? Well, that's a part of how you make HTML5 more compositional. It's not as compositional as XAML, but it does have some strengths in that area. Pipelines. We compose a pipeline by dropping the pieces in to do the things that we need. Rules engines are compositional. I'm going to do an example showing that. 3D modeling is compositional. Bots are compositional. We compose conversations in bots by bringing pieces together. If you've ever seen some of the bot engines that are out there. Cloud computing. If you saw some of the stuff Scott did yesterday, you're dragging pieces around to get the overall solution that you want. That's a compositional way of thinking about things. So composition shows up in all these places. I'm going to zero in on composition in XAML some, because I'm very familiar with it, because it's a very powerful compositional platform, and because it has such a good visual way of showing composition that it's very easy for you to get the idea of what the individual pieces are doing. Does that make sense? So composition in XAML, when you think about how to do XAML with a compositional mindset, it changes the very mental model of how you do UI design. It opens up this huge space of possible designs that you wouldn't have considered if you didn't shift to this, and allow the thing that people don't believe until they make this transition is that it actually allows you to build more advanced UI faster than you could with older technologies. because you just aren't doing as much work. You're picking the pieces and you're letting the pieces do the work. But first, before you can kind of understand this way of doing things, you have to overcome your older mental models about UI. How many of you did some kind of Windows Forms, Classic VB, whatever stuff at some point that was a big part of what you did? Yeah. And even if you did something like web forms, then you had a mental model of how you assembled a screen for the user to do things. And you usually ended up with something about like this. Does this look vaguely familiar to most of you? This is spoofed up. The further you go over to the right, the more you'll see that it's really just made up. But it's the idea of, it's a kind of a demonstration of what you get with the old mental model of creating a user interface. Namely, you kept dragging stuff out of the toolbox until you thought you had enough stuff. Was that pretty much your mental model for creating a user interface? And the things that you dragged over there were controls. And controls were fairly complicated things with a lot of dials and switches. That is, when you thought about a control, it kind of looked like this to you in your mind. That there's just all these things we can do with it. Switches we can turn on and off, and dials and such that we can set to make that particular control do what we want. But that control really didn't talk much to the other controls and didn't have very much to do with them. The pieces weren't really very connected. They were all just kind of sitting around with each other on the screen. Now, it's in some cases, let's say if you use one of those really fancy data grids from Component 1 or Infragistics, now your model of what the control looks like is more like this. There's just all this kind of stuff you can do, and you don't even really know what all of it is, but you dive in as you need to, and you make that particular control do what you want. Well, that mental model needs to change if you're going to go over to the XAML world. Let's see if I can find my place here. Oh, sorry. Because, see, if you try this mental model with XAML, you're going to fail. And the results you're going to get are going to be just about like what you had before. No better, certainly. Maybe even worse. Do some of you, do your spouses not allow you to pick out paint colors at Home Depot? Because if you're that type, then you'll probably end up with XAML that looks like this. So it can actually be any worse. It can be worse. This mental model can be actually made worse. It can be degraded by improper use of composition. You have to understand how to put the pieces together in a graceful way. Let me give you an example, kind of what the basic compositional idea looks like by bringing up a program here. The idea of composition and how this differs from the old model. Let's see if I can find my thing here. Where's my... For example, what's a button? In your mind, what's a button? Well, see, if you think of it as a control, then it's a thing that draws its interior and allows you to click it. But see, in a compositional world, that's not what a button is. In a compositional world, a button is stupid. It doesn't know how to draw itself. All it knows how to do is get clicked. It delegates the capability of drawing itself to someone else, to another part of the compositional system. So that if we look at different possibilities for a button, whoops, sorry, it's the other way, isn't it? Where's the, oh no, it's back on my system here. Sorry, I thought it was doing dual screen. PowerPoint's going back and forth on me. Let me bring that up. There we are. Start that again. That we've got basically the old style of button there, and that's the way you think about buttons, but in a compositional system, a button may be both graphics and a shape. They never did really get that right in older technologies, did they? Because they didn't have a compositional approach. You would have had to put a complete layout engine inside of a button, and nobody in their right mind would ever have done that. But now we assemble what goes on inside the button from pieces. If we want shapes in there, if we want playing videos, if we want the button to be round, the button can delegate that to other parts of the system to change its appearance, but it still has the behavior of a button. The role of a button is to do nothing more than to get pressed. So if you take this old mental model of a lot of dials and switches, you're going to get really confused. I've got an element called a stack panel in XAML. It knows how to stack things. Other than that, it's really stupid. So I know how to stack things. I can stack things vertically, or I can stack things horizontally. That's all it knows how to do. It doesn't, for example, know how to draw a border around itself or scroll. If you put too much stuff in it, it'll just cut it off. How do we get a border? Well, there is another element. We put the stack panel inside the element that provides a border. If we want scrolling, we put it inside the element that provides scrolling. We combine pieces to get the result we want, rather than expecting to get one giant hunk of functionality that does what we want. Now, that's a real shift in the way you have to think about UI. And if you don't, you typically come up with suboptimal results. Now, when you get pretty sophisticated about what you can do with this, then you can do some fairly interesting things. For example, let's see if I can bring up my... This tells the story of an empire under assault because of bad leadership and how it dealt with that. But actually, this is done in Universal Windows Platform XAML, and it is composed of several pieces. It took me about an hour and 20 minutes to create this thing. What kind of pieces do we have? Well, you see that star field back there? That's a canvas with a bunch of stars randomly placed on it. But the text isn't on that canvas. The text is on another canvas that is made to have a three-dimensional appearance and is layered right on top of the other canvas. And that canvas that has the three-dimensional perspective to it has a text block inside of it. And there is an animation applied to the text box to cause it to scroll. So basically, I have those 5 pieces to come together to make this thing work. If I try, I'm never going to find a control that does this. But combining those 5 pieces gave me that capability very, very quickly. By the way, that thing is available for download. It only runs on VS 2015 and Windows 10, but you can get it if you'd like to spice up your next presentation by rolling a movie-style text. It's much better with the music, by the way, but I can't give you the music away. Give the music to you. It's copyrighted. You have to make your own deal with George Lucas for that. So as I said, that little example was pretty easy to do, and that idea of layering, of putting things on top of one another, is not something that developers tend to think a lot about because their older technologies really didn't do things that way. And if you're familiar with the idea of composition in print, the idea of putting layers on top of one another is one of the things they mean by, they use the word compositing, putting layers on top of one another to get the effect that they want. Well, that's basically what we're doing when we've got a UI technology that's able to do that. Let's bring the slides up and show you another couple of examples. So this is, okay, look at the thing over there on the right. That's a list of contacts or customers or whatever. Which one of those is a happy doctor? Mary? You think Mary's the happy doctor? Well, see, you haven't been trained on that application. How could you possibly know that? Well, because we've layered the information that you need in such a way that it's very easy for you to absorb. We don't put a bunch of text in grid cells, you see. We give you stuff that your eyes know how to work with, and we put it in layers because that's the way the real world works. So we just layer that stuff on there. If you see down there, for Halo 4, they had this thing that showed your character, the armor, your rank, and the other stuff, and it layered that stuff. That's done in HTML5, by the way. And then the thing up at the top is a real example for an application we did. That is a representation of a cattle pen. And by glancing at it, you know that it's roughly half full, don't you? Even if it were fairly small on the screen, you would know that cattle pen was about half full. And the little symbol up in the top means that cattle pen has a roof on it. and some of them don't have a roof. So we just layer that information into that little space without spreading stuff out all over a big screen, which means we have a more compact way of dealing with UI. That's pretty important in an age of devices, isn't it? Plus, we can get the information across to people much, much more quickly. Layering can also be used just to make things very nice and aesthetic. That application the cattle pen example came from. This is the dashboard, and look at that lovely watermark. It just makes you feel good about the application. And we're using the layering capabilities of this compositional engine in order to do that. And as with the Star Wars example, it isn't really that hard. Now, I'm going to emphasize that composition is all over the place, even though I do use a lot of XAML examples early on here. I do have some other examples later. I see various degrees of composition in all kinds of platforms. There's even the germ of composition in the reusable functions that we used to create as our primary way of programming a long time ago. And we got some more compositional capabilities with object orientation. Because if you go to the OO books from the 90s, they will actually talk about the compositional pattern of objects using collections and such. But it was kind of a sideline. It wasn't the main way you thought about objects. The main way you thought about objects was the giant object that did a whole bunch of stuff with dials and switches and knobs. The original HTML had some composition, mostly for content, but it was moving in a compositional direction. Rules engines do composition. 3D modeling is heavily compositional. You're basically building the 3D model out of pieces analogous to the pieces in the real world. So it's extremely compositional. XAML, I think, is probably the most compositional platform around, but HTML5 is moving on up beyond the original HTML, and things like bots all have compositional concepts in them. So you don't have to make a quantum leap to composition because we've been using some of these concepts for a long time. You can kind of move up the stack from some of the things you've already done and just think about composition a little more explicitly as you move to platforms that allow you to use it more effectively. See, we have these compositional platforms, but most people are kind of code-centric in the way that they look at solving problems in this industry, so they don't tend to think about the compositional aspects so much. Our processes, even, are very code-centric. We have backlogs and sprints and stand-ups, and the idea behind all of that is to grind out code that satisfies a feature, and we typically think about solving that feature problem in a fairly linear way, not in composing the various pieces that do it. Because when we think about composition, we usually have to sort of step back and look at a bigger picture to use composition effectively. If we're zeroed in on features at a very granular level, it's much harder to think about the overall problem in terms of composition. But really, you kind of like it the way you have it, don't you? A lot of you do, I know. Writing code in this procedural, imperative way to solve problems. I know you do because I've been talking about this for years, that there's this substance abuse problem in the industry. Some of you have seen me talk about this before, right? You guys are addicted to code? I mean, really. If you can't stop coding in your head during a meeting, you realize that's the sign of an addiction, don't you? You're probably a codehead if you do that. That's just kind of one letter different from cokehead. You just can't wait to get back to your office and do a few lines. That's the kind of addiction you have when you want to be doing things with code, and our industry has pushed you in that direction to the point where you tend to think that way, and you've almost conditioned yourself to get such pleasure out of that it's kind of hard to break loose into different approaches. So I understand that there are barriers there, but I think that you'll get a lot of benefit out of kind of getting control of your addiction and learning to solve problems with some other approaches. Let's take a look at another example in which I just put the pieces together in XAML to make things work. This was from a session actually at a VS Live conference a few months ago. And let's see if I can, there it is. I'll run this and let you see it in operation. And then I'll actually show you some of the XAML, see how some things are put together there. This is the idea of I want to show planes at some gates. And I want the planes to kind of have some color coding telling how long it is before they take off, and maybe I want to have the ability to put the plane at a different gate. So I want the plane to move over there. Now see, it moved here. Why didn't you? The video feed is giving me trouble with animation. The plane is in a different place on my screen. I promise you. And it moved over there nice and smoothly, too. So this projector is lying to you. I don't really know why. Oh, no, is that still the slide? Well, see, that's PowerPoint. I thought PowerPoint had turned off. Didn't PowerPoint turn off? It did not, did it? All right. PowerPoint in multiple screens, I'm still getting used to it because it kind of automatically goes to multiple screens under certain conditions, and then it puts the screen sort of back the way it was without telling you. So now I think I've got PowerPoint taken care of. Let's go back and try it again. Let's get my, oops, not that one. Where is it? Yeah, right there. Start this guy again. Honest, the plane does move. If I give it a new gate, it'll trot over to that gate. So I have the ability to use animation to sort of help people maintain context. If I just kind of pop things over, the eye wouldn't necessarily kind of realize where it went to. It wouldn't be kind of obvious. But if I animate it over there, then it does. And that's a part of the compositional platform in XAML, the fact that we can use animation. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the history of this example. I was doing this session. I wasn't on XAML and some of the stuff you could do, and I wasn't satisfied with my demos. And I woke up at 7 in the morning for a 10 o'clock session with this idea in my head, and I wrote it in about an hour and 20 minutes. Because all I'm doing is stitching pieces together. Now, for those of you who are in the XAML world, what is that control that's handling the planes? Any guesses? Timeline? Well, there's not a timeline control built in. It's a list box. It really is. It's a list box. Because a list box is stupid. The only thing a list box knows how to do is manufacture data items based on a list. It does not know how to arrange items. It delegates that to another piece of the compositional framework. Normally, a list box has a stack panel inside of it, so that when it creates the items, the stack panel just stacks them up. But I changed this list box out and put a canvas in place and told the items to position themselves based on their gate numbers. Here, I'll show you the XAML for this. We'll go over and look at the main window. There are actually a couple of where's my mouse? Because I need to make this code bigger. Is there a way to make it bigger without the scroll button? Right down there. Oh, yeah, the percentage right there. Yeah, let's bump that to about 200%. You read that a little bit better? All right, now, there are actually a couple of different list box canvases here. There's one canvas that's just got a bunch of rectangles and text blocks. That is the concourse. The concourse, you know, it's just a bunch of rectangles and text blocks is all it was. So there's one canvas that furnishes the concourse. And then sitting right on top of it, using that layering capability, is a list box. It's transparent, of course, so that the concourse behind it can show. And then it's bound to a list of sample planes. But instead of using the usual stack panel, I tell it, no, you should use this canvas to position the planes. And there's a place where there's the data template for the planes. Basically, there's a rectangle, and that view box has that path. That path is the shape of the plane. Now, here's the thing about that. Hour and 20 minutes. Do you think I drew the plane? No, because I'm one of the laziest SOBs in this industry. If there's a way to find a piece, I'm going to use it. Where did I get the plane? I've got a place to get pieces like that. That place is a little free program called Metro Studio from Syncfusion. So if you need to get shapes to put into your composition, there you go. I think I used that plane right there, and I applied an angle to it so that the nose is always pointing to the concourse. So I'm just putting pieces together here. That's why it didn't take me very long to do it. There's very little code in this particular application. If you go over, I do the, let's see if, as a matter of fact, there's no code at all. I couldn't remember whether I had to write any code at all. There's absolutely no code at all in that application. It's just a bunch of pieces put together in XAML. How do I get the planes to move smoothly? Well, that's another piece. Let's take a look at that piece. Remember the canvas that I said the planes go on? Right there? Well, there's a piece whose responsibility it is that when a visual element moves, when you just set it to a new position, it grabs it and says, well, no, I'm not going to let you just pop it over there. I'm going to animate it over there for you. So I didn't write any of that animation. There's a piece that does that for me. Is this making sense now? I'm just kind of Legoing things together to get a result. But if you had an analogous problem like that and you put that solution as a potential solution in front of your stakeholders, what would they think about that? They would think you were a bloody genius, wouldn't they? That's the benefit of being able to think compositionally and put pieces together. You can get incredibly impressive results very, very quickly. Here's one more quick one I'm going to show you. I'll go ahead and put it up and then put the slide up that goes with it. Where's the... This is a new take on the old problem of multiple select list boxes, which they've never really managed to get right, have they? As a control, I've never really seen one that works very well with long lists. So here's the one that I've got. You can see two examples of it there on the bottom. So if I need to put in items, I can just type one in and hit return, and it'll just put that one in. Or I can put in some kind of descriptor, and it'll show me all the ones that match. And then I can say, yeah, I'd like that one and that one. 101 is already checked because it was part of the list before. And then I've got some stuff over here, see? And I go, yeah, I've decided I don't want 303. Let's take that one out. And oh, yeah, I think I'll take 10, whatever. And they just keep doing them. And basically, that thing along the bottom lists them until I get to a certain configurable number of 4. In this case, I can make that number anything. And this is, yeah, you got one more besides the ones that are listed. So there's a data template that says shows what the selected items looks like, cattle pens in this case. And you can kind of see how full they are and what their number is. So we see the ones that are selected. We can select by typing them in. We can select by picking from a list. We can manage the list. And it's really just a bunch of pieces put together. Now, for this particular user scenario, they felt this was a much better way to do multiple selection than any of the things that they'd ever tried before. Do some of you look at this and go, yeah, I think we could use this? Hands, please. Some of you that go, yeah, I think this might be a good approach to the way we would do things. And if we go to the slides and kind of look at it, again, it's just pieces being put together. I actually did write a control for this, but the control itself is just a bunch of compositional pieces. Let me show it on the slides. See, that's what it looks like, both in the base state and then in the pop-down state. And what's really going on here is that there's a list control there to show the selected items, and there's a special template for what selected items are supposed to look like. And then there's another list control for you to choose the items that match the thing in the box. And there's another list control that shows all of the currently selected items, no matter how many there are. See, the one that's horizontal only shows up to a certain number, and you get to determine what that number is. You with me? So when I go into the control template for this control, it's got a text box, it's got a button for searching, it's got an items control beneath the text box, and it's got a pop-down that's got, it's actually a fly-out control in Windows 10 with 2 more lists and some buttons to manage that. Just a composition to create that, and it really doesn't have a whole lot of code in it. It's got a little bit of code to kind of rationalize the lists and to do the searching of the items. This is making sense now as an approach. So that's an idea of some of the stuff you can do in XAML that illustrates the compositional capabilities of it. And you can extend these capabilities to, when I wrote this particular system, I actually created a container called a validator. If you put stuff inside the validator with some tags to show what kind of validation logic you want, that something is required or it's in a given range or something like that, then the validator automatically runs the logic to enforce that. The validator is really pretty stupid about what's inside of it. All it knows is, yeah, that thing right there needs to be required. And I will run the logic to make that happen. That's its entire responsibility. But as a container, it can then validate all the stuff that's inside of it. See, that's a very different approach from saying, oh yeah, well, we're ready to save the form. Let's stream out a whole bunch of code, a whole bunch of linear code that validates. You've written that code, right? It's nasty. Have you ever written it bug-free? Anybody ever written much of that code and have it be bug-free at the first time? No, see, it's messy, it's buggy. It's not the sort of code you want to write. And a compositional approach means we write almost none of that code at all in our XAML programs because we have extended the compositional platform to do it instead. Different way of thinking, completely different way of thinking. Let's move on now and talk about some other places that composition really makes a lot of sense. I'm going to show you a simplified example in which I have shapes that get sorted by a rules engine into bins. And then it's particularly constructed to show composition with rules. Let's actually run it. Now get back to here. Okay, so I've got some rules engines here. I'm sorry, a list of rules. Those rules are defined, the starting rules are defined in XAML. They could be defined anywhere. They could be defined in a database or whatever. I'll show you the rules just very quickly so you can see them. That's right over here, isn't it? Yeah. There are my rules. I am routing triangles that are blue and small into the first target bin. I'm routing squares that are green and medium-sized into the first bin. If anything's a circle, I'm going to route it into bin 2. And anything that's red, I'm going to route into bin 3. And then I just route everything else into bin 4. So that's my routing rules. As you can see, it's easy as pie to create new ones. I could even create a designer for new rules if I wanted to. And I can move the rules around as much as I want to so that, is that the one? So that if I say, yeah, I want the red stuff to go in bin 3, and if I move that up, then now the red stuff will go in bin 3, and now the red circles won't go into bin 2. See, if this is at the bottom, the red circles will go into bin 2. Let's see that in where's my little thing there? Where's my other window? All right. Where did my little window go? All right, I'll stop you and start you again. Make you come up. There's both my windows. All right, so now there's my window, and with the way it is, I'm just going to put a bunch of random shapes. I'm just going to generate random shapes and let them be routed. I haven't seen a red circle. Oh, there we go. See the red circle going into bin 2? Because any circle goes into bin 2, but all the rest of the red stuff goes into bin 3. Now, if I do a restart and change the order of the rules, then red circles will go to a different place. So I'll move that up. So the order matters here. Notice the little switch thing? The smooth moving? Guess what? How I'm doing that? It's the same thing I use to move the planes around. It's just a piece that moves things smoothly. All right, let's go till we get a red circle here and see where it goes. There's a red circle. It no longer goes to bin 2, it goes to bin 3. So we have the ability then for shapes to go kind of wherever they need to go into various bins, and we've got configurable rules to do this. Now, let's look a little bit at the combinatorics of this. Three shapes plus the idea of any shape times 3 colors plus any color times 3 sizes. That's 4 times 4 times 4. So now I've got 64 possible rules that I might have. But it's much more impressive combinatorically than that because the order of the rules matters. And if I combined all of the rules, that's 64 factorial, which is a really big number. See, I could put the exact number on there, but it wouldn't matter to you. You wouldn't remember it, so it's a really big number. But really, I might not be using all the rules. The real thing is that it's the number of combinations is 64 factorial plus 63 factorial plus 62 factorial, et cetera, which comes out to an even bigger number. And this is a very, very simple compositional arrangement that gives us this enormous number of combinations. Now you look at that and think, oh, that's kind of probably a contrived example, Billy. What good does that do? Actually, this example was inspired by something I did in Windows Forms. Back in 2004, we were arranging to automate a company that shipped drugs to prisons. See, prisons don't go down to Walgreens and get drugs. So what we had was a bunch of queues where stages of the processing got done, handling all the workflow inside this particular facility. There was a queue of faxes that came in with orders, and they came in from the web, and there was a queue of orders that came from those two, and a customer service queue if there were issues, and the pharmacist had to approve it. We've got all these different queues, and things would then move around among the queues based on a router that had routing engines, that had routing rules, that knew how to get it to the next queue. Does that obviously map right onto the thing I just showed you? Except that, of course, this is quite a bit more complex. Now, let's talk about how that benefited these folks. When we designed this, we expected to have about 20 queues and maybe 24 routing rules. But when we got done, we had 40 queues and about 100 routing rules. And the routing rules kind of were about what you'd expect. They were basically a little component that knew how to work within the whole queuing system with a little bit of code that looked at the data to decide what to do. Oh, this is an order, it's for a controlled substance, it's a prescription for a controlled substance, it's got to go there for extra approval, and then it gets routed to the controlled substances bin. Does that make sense? So because we approach this problem from a purely compositional standpoint, their ability to expand the functionality of the thing, even in the course of development, was dramatically increased. We didn't have to really do a lot of custom stuff. In fact, we created it so that there was a dashboard to create new queues, and you had to create new rules. You had to get a developer to do that, but really they only had to write typically about a dozen or 24 lines of code to create a new routing rule. So that's another example of where composition makes a big difference in your ability to solve problems. That it expands the functionality. We can have as many cues as we want. We can have as many rules as we want. We don't have to know everything when we create the system. Because that's the bane of our applications, isn't it? That in order to do it kind of imperatively and linearly, we gotta know everything. And then when we go back to make changes, because we gotta find the place inside the imperative thing to fix it, it's very messy to expand functionality and fix it. With a compositional platform, it's far easier to add new functionality without breaking stuff, because the pieces are much more loosely connected. I mentioned pipelines. They're a very simple form of composition. You could imagine a pipeline that does compression. Maybe the green does compression. And then maybe maybe the green does, I don't know, base 64 or something. I don't know, whatever you need in the pipeline to transmit some bytes along. And then maybe we decide at some point that we need encryption. Well, we just have to sort of put in the thing that does that, slide that into place. As long as the individual pieces in the pipeline don't really much care about the bytes that they're passing along, as long as they just know what to do with their particular set of bytes, then we can just kind of shove pieces in and out and compose the solution we want for a pipeline. So pipelines have compositional aspects to them. Composition's all over the place. I've talked about XAML and HTML5, that some of the frameworks are moving it that way. Pipelines, rules, you've seen rules engines. 3D modeling is fairly obvious. Bots and cloud computing. In fact, for me, that's kind of what's driving a lot of this stuff, is the need to make HTML5 more compositional, to be able to put pieces together. Now, the composition model in HTML5 and JavaScript is not perfect. And it's a little bit more fluid than, I think, the very well-designed compositional model in some other places. It does work, but I get the feeling sometimes, that an HTML5 page or app is coming together from all these pieces, kind of like the liquid metal Terminator, When it got blown up, it's just all the pieces kind of creep together and present the page. So there's a little bit of this fluid nature to it that isn't quite as clean, but you certainly can do some impressive things if you're willing to sort of figure out all these pieces and how they all fit together. The problem is that as a platform, these pieces aren't designed to fit together. That's why the compositional capabilities in HTML5 are more limited than those in XAML. You can make things work, you just have to work a lot harder to make it happen. So how does this change sort of your approach for your job? Well, if you're going to embrace compositional methods of doing things, you want to spend more time looking at the pieces that are available. If you don't know Metro Studios out there and you're trying to do XAML, now you're giving away a lot of the value, because shapes are one of the main ways to visualize data. But look, we're not artists, and doing shapes is time consuming, so we just need to go get pieces for that. We don't need to be... See, our old way of thinking is, I gotta create a piece. No, just go get a piece that already does it. Try to work on compositional solutions to problems to tune your brains that way. For example, when I train in XAML classes, do I have the slide on this? Yeah, I do. When I do an exercise in my XAML class, it's, here you go, make it look like this. Make it do this. Step-by-step exercises are virtually useless, I find, in trying to teach people XAML because of the compositional nature of it. Step-by-step is not bad for teaching you imperative problem solving, procedural problem solving, but it really isn't very good for teaching you composition. So you have to come up with other ways to look at composition, to tune your brain a bit. I find that a compositional approach makes me tend to spend more time trying to understand the problem and crafting a mental model for how to solve it. And this is in direct opposition to some people who will tell you that you just can't do that. That you're just supposed to be in there grinding out code. You're supposed to be in those sprints and getting stuff done. And okay, well, I guess for a code-centric approach that's all right, but I've never done a code-centric approach, so I spend more time crafting and understanding the problem. And when I've got the right mental model, I find solving the problem is so much faster and easier, and it yields a much higher value result. So the lesson there is, don't just, when you when you're trying to approach things from a compositional viewpoint, don't just jump in and start typing XAML. How many of you have done that, by the way? You've tried out, you've done some WPF or Silverlight or something, and you just started, what did you end up with? Garbage. Because you don't really understand what the pieces you need are. So you're just kind of, what you end up with is a pile of pieces. You probably never thought about it that way, but that's really what you had, is a pile of pieces that didn't necessarily hook together the way that they needed to. So they were garbage. So don't just walk up to one of these compositional platforms and start writing. Think about what the problem is going to need to be solved. Now, there are some issues. Composition certainly, is with anything else, has its pros and cons. It takes a long time to learn to think this way. You have to kind of adjust your brain. Do you get the feeling on some of these things you've seen from me that you go, I don't know that I would ever figure out how to do that? Actually, most of you would, if you tuned your brain toward compositional concepts. Not everybody. I find that when we make a conceptual shift like this, I remember trying to teach COBOL programmers Visual Basic back in the 1990s. And some of them just didn't make it. They couldn't expand their mind around event-driven, relational, whatever, when they'd done all this procedural COBOL their whole life. But I think developers today are a little bit looser, and I think most of them can learn how to do composition. Diagnosing a problem can be hard. You guys who do XAML know this, right? Something goes wrong, which piece is it? Just figuring out which piece is the problem, or the setting on that piece of the connection, it can be a real challenge. Because see, you can't just step through debugging the way you do in kind of a linear imperative way of doing things. So trying to solve problems, diagnose problems is hard. Unit testing. If I got a compositional approach, unit testing doesn't take me as far, because the unit testing is like testing the rules engine or something, but it isn't testing the rules. And coming up with a representative sample of rules to work out the engine is hard. And now how do I know whether a given set of rules is valid or makes any sense? See, I can easily set up rules for which there are rules that never get accessed because things above that have already grabbed everything that rule would ever be working on. So now I need new ways of making sure my rules are coherent. And unit testing really isn't a particularly good way to do that. And of course, some of the platforms don't really support it that well. So go out and build some libraries of pieces. Find some good composition-based platform to work on and tune your brain. Now, there are people around here that tell you that you should be doing everything in JavaScript and HTML5, and if you want to do that, that's fine. But go ahead and try to apply some composition. I think XAML's pretty neat, but of course, my self-interest is to tell you, don't learn XAML. Please don't learn XAML. That way, people will keep paying me rates that if I told you what they were, you wouldn't believe. The fewer of you who know how to do it, the better my bank account is. So don't learn XAML. No, it is a good platform for understanding the compositional approach, and it will help you translate some of the compositional ideas into other platforms. All right, I've left a couple of minutes for questions. Let me remind you, we are going to give away those tickets in case you came out late. We've got, where's my HoloLens? Oh, here it is. We've got 20 slots for people to put one of these on their head and actually use it. We're going to put those in a random drawing because we've only got time and such for 20 or so. I wish we could do all of you. I genuinely do, and we just can't. So if you're interested, make sure you get a ticket. Make sure you put the right one in the bowl, and we will draw the tickets and post during the other drawing stuff that's happening after lunch. We'll post a thing for all the winners. And Brian, what's the time? Are you around?
Right here.
What's the time? Then they show up?
They'll be on the board because you'll have a time slot between 3.
Oh, you're going to put time slots with the winners then? Okay, cool. So look at that at the drawing. Now, so we've got maybe 2 minutes or so for questions on this, please. Anybody got any?
1 minute.
1 minute. He's cutting me off. 1 minute. Apparently he wants to get you guys to lunch. Okay, so I got time for one question or two maybe, depending on how long the first one answer is. You guys can't wait to get to lunch, do you? And I didn't make a lick of sense. I can just tell. You're just looking at me like, we don't even know what questions to ask, Billy. Well, I'll be around for the next 2 days. So if you think, oh, got one back there. Yes.
What about reuse?
What about reuse? Well, Typically, in composition-based approaches, the pieces are reusable, but the rearrangements are custom for a particular situation. Now, we might package up a set of a particular combination to reuse as a part of other combinations, and that's part of the compositional approach. But there are certainly some arrangements, some compositions that are custom, and we don't worry about reusing them, but we do make sure that the pieces are very loosely connected and reusable. Right here, one more. WPF is what we, WPF and UWP, Universal Windows, are the two main XAML platforms. All right, go have some lunch. Holler at me if you need to later. I look forward to. You've been a good audience.